In the last episode of Project ZXR400, you joined me and young Spencer collecting the project from Johnny where it had been sat abandoned in a barn. Well, a shed. Essentially, I got it back home and had to strip the carbs apart, and then we attempted to start the old girl, and I'm pleased to report things went much better than expected. Relieved that I hadn't purchased an absolute lemon and the engine was, well, what appeared to be golden. It then went on for a deep clean, which then brings us on to the latest episode. The first purchase was a set of bobbin stands. Unfortunately, it's a real pain working on the bike length over. With these being an M12 thread, I didn't have any in the shelf, so I did have to get online and order a set, which thankfully arrived the following day. I also picked up a new Yuasa battery from my local Halfords. As this one had been left for so long, it was definitely not going to take charge. They die after literally a year if you leave them flat. So got to fit in on that, ready to make sure we could do some compression testing to fingers crossed confirm that the engine was going to be okay. With the new battery fitted, the ignition powers up nicely, and I address another job that's been on the list for a little while since collecting the bike, and that was the sticky throttle. Unfortunately, it just wouldn't naturally return when you rolled off, which one is an MOT failure and two, it's actually pretty dangerous. So I certainly needed to sort it out. And again, I've done this in the past and typically it's just where the cables dry out or moisture or water's got into the cables. You can replace them, or as I'll show here using my trusty ACF50, which I think I use on absolutely everything. You can disassemble all of the switchgear, remove the throttle grip, and then you can gain access to the cables, the throttle cables, and essentially moving them ever so slightly up and down, spraying ACF50 in there. The ACF50 will just run with gravity down the cable and it works absolutely wonderfully. And again, ACF50 is not designated to do this, but I found from previous experience it just works so well and it doesn't dry out. Whereas if you use something like WD-40, it just doesn't unfortunately last very long. It'll work initially and a few months later the problem will be back. But I would strongly suggest using a decent oil in there. And as I've shown here, you don't actually have to buy replacements, which with these old bikes is not always easy or cheap. As discussed in episode 1, I did have slight concerns with the engine. Although everything fired up wonderfully when we did test it, because it was low on coolant when I collected and there was a puncture in the radiator, I was really concerned that some damage may have happened with the bike running hot. So there's always that doubt that it could be a head gasket problem. So the first test is a compression test. And as you can see here, we have to take all of the air box off. We have to get the throttle bodies removed and then we can gain access to the spark plugs. With the carburetors safely removed and put to one side, I cover up the inlet ports with some rag. Because essentially, as we're going to be pulling bits out, the last thing I want is something to fall down that inlet track, which would be disastrous for the engine. Also give everything a good coating of ACF50. As I showed in the previous RSV restoration, it makes engine cases look absolutely wonderful again that are in a raw rally finish. With everything clean, preventing anything from falling down the spark plug holes, I can then remove the leads and the spark plugs themselves. It was a little concerning because when I undid these, they almost felt as if they'd just been done up hand tight. But when I checked the torque settings afterwards, they are only 13 Newton meters. So not a great amount of torque, which I'm pleased with. And once removed, it looks like there was no damage to the thread. And whilst we're looking at the plugs, I must say they look pretty much brand new, with the exception of a little blackness on the tip, which is probably from where we started it up on that first start and left it rough running on idle. So it definitely needs a good Italian tune-up, but I've got no interest in replacing these plugs as they look practically new. The first step in our health check is a compression test on the engine, and essentially you need to remove all the spark plugs and make sure that the throttle tracks are either open, or in our case where we've removed the carbs, or hold the throttle at wide open throttle. You don't want to have any petrol in the system, so this is perfect as we've removed the carbs, but essentially we're going to force the engine to crank over each cylinder and we'll find out what compression is in each cylinder. You really want to do this when the engine's warm, but ideally we're looking anything over 150 psi cold. With the engine making 190 to 200 psi per cylinder on a cold engine, I'm absolutely thrilled with the outcome and confident that we've got no terminal damage with this engine as a result of it potentially at some stage maybe run low on coolant. So all we need to do now is put the spark plugs back in, and as mentioned in the earlier part of the episode, it's only 13 Newton meters on these, so certainly not a lot of torque to crank these back up to factory spec. Refitting the carburetors is essentially the same as the removal, but just in reverse. But what I will add is it's worth putting a small amount of red grease just on the carburetor rubbers, because this allows the bodies to seat comfortably on there without pinching or damaging the rubber boots that you're going back into. And as can be seen here, it really is straightforward. Certainly not rocket science to do a compression test on one of these engines. I've worked on other bikes in the past where you can't quite access all the spark plug holes easily, whereas this one, absolute joy, and pleased again to report that we don't have to do any further diagnostics on the engine. It's then on to the airbox, and the first job I wanted to do was remove the snorkel, which effectively reduces intake noise, as we certainly don't want that. It's then on to the air filter, and thankfully the previous owner had installed a K&N, so these are essentially lifelong, but you do need to clean and re-oil them. I had hoped I could have just undone the two 10mm nuts inside the airbox, but unfortunately it's just not that straightforward. You do need to separate the airbox into two halves. Fortunately, this isn't overly difficult, but once the filter is removed, I was pleased to report it was actually really clean and in good order, but it was dry. So we used some K&N oil filter spray just to re-lubricate it, because essentially this oil will stop all the small particles getting through the mesh in the filter. With the air filter re-oiled, it could then all go back in the airbox. But before doing that, I did want to have a quick look of the setup on the bike. Now, as this was in two halves, I could essentially assemble one half on there. You can certainly see it's really compact on that design, but it does work really nicely, and it's going to get that fresh air feed from the air ducts coming off of the nose cone fairing. But we'll come back to that once we've got all the bodywork ready to go, and we'll go over it in more detail. Happy with everything being re-oiled, I can then assemble the airbox back together, and as mentioned, this is just two halves held together with a couple of crosshead screws. With that all assembled, you can then go back over to the bike, place the airbox on top, and there are a couple of 10mm bolts which hold the airbox to the carburetors. Now, there are two bolts that are under rubber grommets which essentially hold the centre of the airbox down to the carburetors, and I'm going to be honest, I don't really like these, because essentially if they were to come loose they would make their way into the inlet track, which is certainly not ideal because it's going to be goodbye engine. So really I'm probably going to go back and put some lock thread on those the more I think about it, just in case they did vibrate loose. With the airbox complete, it was then on to the drive chain, and unfortunately this had just gone rotten from years of neglect. Now, from the outside this probably looks like it's fit for the bin, but I can assure you these things can be drastically improved, and as long as there's no tight or pinch spots, you're going to be good to go, because you've got the O-rings sealing the internal links. So I'm going to show you a little tip that I use with, again, ACF50, a little wire wheel on a soft drill brush, and then essentially it looks brand new again. But do bear in mind you're going to remove some of that protective coating, so you do need to keep it well oiled if you want it to stay looking like this for years to come. With the bulk of the ACF50 removed just with a simple microfiber and wipe over, you can then protect the chain correctly with some chain lube. And I like using the Worth dry lube, as essentially this doesn't fling mess all over the rear wheel, especially when you've got one like this where it's green, because it's really going to stand out and look messy using a really wet chain oil. With the chain completely restored back to, well, as good as new as it's going to be on this project, it was time to look at that faulty radiator that unfortunately been leaking. Now, there was still quite a bit of coolant in the bike, so he's going to need to drop that out. So it's best to put this in a drain tub because it can get quite messy. Unfortunately, a lot of the coolant that came out of the bike was also rust. So whoever had been topping this up before had been using water and was unfortunately aware of that leak being there. With the coolant drained and the hoses unclipped, it was clear there was some horrible grime in the radiator system, especially as there was present rust on the internals of the rad. So I was going to need to flush the complete system, but the good news is I have bought the replacement radiator I showed in the last video, so I'm hoping this is going to be here in the next week or two so we can finally fix the cooling system. I will take the bike outside and give it a proper flush through with a hose because it certainly isn't going to be clever inside the block either. The final bit was just to actually remove the radiator, but all the brackets that held it in place had either been knocked or bent, and this is obviously as a result of the category C write-off that happened to the bike previously. Whether that was caused due to the leak to the radiator, the accident, or whether it happened afterwards through corrosion, I guess we're never going to know. But ultimately it's off and a new replacement will be with us shortly. With the radiator on the bench, it's clear to see it wasn't looking so clever, but this now did allow access to behind the radiator where I could cover absolutely everything in ACF 50 to soak up whilst we wait for the parts to arrive. Finally, someone also guessed the correct price on the project itself, so it'll be interesting to keep track of how much I spend on this build, but I'm hoping it's going to be a relatively cheap one. So that's it for this part of the video. We've just got to now wait for all the bits to turn up, and in the meantime I decided to take it off the bench and get Project RS125 back underway. Those that followed the other build, Project RS125 was really taking shape, and again, just like the ZXR400, there was as much as I could do at this point, so it was time to get the Aprilia off the bench and move the Kawasaki back, as finally all the parts had arrived for the big service. The first job on the to-do list was getting the indicators back. This is going to be a road legal bike, so they're going to have to work. But as in all things in my fashion, it was never going to be straightforward. So the first thing was to do was just to check that we actually had voltage to the indicator loom, which, yeah, I think was a good test before chopping and soldering everything. And as you can see here, proved to be a valuable one. The voltmeter was set to 12 volts. And unfortunately, clicking between left and right, I had no 12 volt signal being there. And on my voltmeter, it's normally pretty good, to be honest with you. So it's disappointing to see, but ultimately not surprising, especially with an old bike where this loom had been chopped. So the first thing to check was the fuses, just in case something had been cross-wired when they were cut and removed and had shorted out the fuse itself. As can hopefully be seen, the indicator fuse is okay, so I don't need to do any further investigation on this side of things. The next thing is to check the flasher relay, and this is essentially responsible for making the indicator blink. And all you do is you put the indicator on, pull the relay out, and you should have a 12 volt live there, which we do. So this does indicate that the flasher relay is at fault. But what happens next is I plug it back into the loom and it starts working. So I can only assume this is just because it hasn't been used for a long time. It may have got stuck. But pleased to report, with the flasher relay now working, we can solder and heat shrink all the wires going back to the indicators, so it's as good as factory and nice and watertight. With everything soldered and heat shrinked, I then cover the loom in electrical tape, as this gives a more factory finish to what's already in place. And the good news is the rear is now working perfectly. They do blink a little fast, and this is purely because the fronts aren't connected, so the balance isn't there for the flasher relay. But once the fronts are in, this will all work perfectly. As you can see, the bench is loaded with all the new goodies to go on the bike, and the main one is the new radiator, as that old one was absolutely destroyed. Now unfortunately we did have to wait for this to come from Europe, and when it landed I did get hit with some awful import charges. I'm going to be one of those people who says I never voted Brexit and this sort of stuff. It really hurts us petrol heads when we're trying to get parts in. But ultimately the new radiator on first inspections looks absolutely really good, and I think wow, what a bargain. I've absolutely saved the radiator issue now. But on closer inspection it does unfortunately have some imperfections, and it's missing some of the top brackets, so unfortunately not ideal. But there is going to be a solution that we overcome this. The first job for the radiator is to move over the clips that hold the nuts that we can secure all the cooling fan to, but unfortunately the material used on the new fan is thicker than the old, so these clips don't work. So what I essentially end up doing is removing the nut from the clip, and we're just going to have to hold it with a spanner. It's not going to be held by the bracket itself. It's still going to work the same, just going to be fiddly if you ever change the fan in the future. Back over to the workbench, and before we refit that new radiator, one of the first things I wanted to do was change the oil and filter, as ultimately once the radiator is in place it's going to make it more tricky to get to the oil filter. Not impossible, but it certainly doesn't make sense, as we're going to be doing this at the same time to try risking damaging any of the fins on the back of the new radiator. So getting the tools out, it's time to drain that old oil and have our first look at what condition the old oil was actually in. With the oil filter removed, you can actually see how clean it is inside where the filter screws on, which means the internals of the block should actually be pretty clean. The oil filter itself, the residue that was left on it was also not horrific, which is pleasing to see. So I do believe the bike has had a service, may have been a few years ago, but it certainly hasn't done any mileage. So before we put the new filter back on, I do want to make sure that all the housing around there is clean. And I wouldn't normally use brake cleaner shooting into where the oil filter opening is, and I make sure I aim downwards so it floods back out. But as there was a lot of grit and grime around there, I certainly didn't want it getting onto the new oil filter seal and causing a leak. Typically I would always stick with an OEM genuine filter, but the high flow filters aren't a bad product and they come pre-oiled on the seal, so you don't have to worry about smearing some oil on there. With that done, it's just simply a case of winding the filter back on, not going too mad because you certainly don't want it to be a pain for the next person who services the bike trying to undo it. With my trusty O-ring box to hand, it's simply a case of cleaning up the drain plug and fitting it back using a torque wrench. And I also treat the sump to a good brake clean as well, because there's certainly a lot of grease and grime that's accumulated over the years, and I can't actually see any leak coming from the block, so God knows where that's accumulated from over the years. The bike calls for 3 litres of engine oil, and again I stick to motorcycle branded products because you do have to be careful with the wet clutches on motorcycles. Essentially fill it up and I go to the maximum point, and the reason I do this is I know once that oil filter primes up it is going to drop a little bit. I certainly don't go over the maximum point, but I'm happy with the pouring spout on the motor bottle. Certainly makes life much easier than mucking about with a funnel. The old brackets on the radiator are bent, but I need these. I haven't got them on the new one, so what I need to do before I remove them from the old radiator is straighten them up, because it's certainly going to be a lot harder to do when they're on the new radiator and I don't want to risk damaging it. The problem is these are formed onto the old radiator, so I need to drill them out, and once they're drilled out I'm then going to have to try and sand them down, key them up. I'm using a JB Weld, which I've used many times in the past, secure these to the new radiator. In an ideal world I'd weld these, but my welding on steel is average at best. I dread to think what state I'd make of that radiator trying to weld on alley. So this is the best solution I've got, and as I've mentioned in other videos, JB Weld is pretty impressive stuff. I really should be an ambassador for it. With the JB Weld needing 24 hours to set, the Grom sneakily snuck back on the bench for a YouTube feature. It then went back onto the floor and the ZXR400 was placed back on. And this is when I actually realised I don't have any front engine bolts. The show must go on, and I needed to get that radiator fitted, but the first job was to try and flush the old coolant out of the system, as I really didn't want to mix the colours. The problem is, as you'll see here, I tried to use methods to flush it through, and the thermostat, I believe, is just stopping any coolant from completely removing from the block. This is not uncommon, but the risk I had is if I removed the thermostat and I didn't have a gasket, I wasn't going to be able to put it back together. So I did my best in filling both sides up with water, draining it back out, and that was as good as it was going to be. What I will do in a later episode is I'll go for a few rides and then we'll drop the coolant again, as I've got plenty left over from the big 5 litre bottle. The final task for the old radiator was to remove the sensor that was still fitted in place. With that done, I could then move on to fitting the fan onto the new radiator, which was just those 3 bolts that I had to use a spanner to hold because we didn't have them retaining brackets, and then fit the new sensor back into the radiator, and she was good to go. I must admit, it was actually looking pretty good, all built back together. With all the coolant pipes reconnected, it was then a case of filling it up with coolant, and during this process you undo the bleed screw to try and help some air move from the lower part of the engine, do it back up, continue filling the bike up, and then the final step I use is actually taking the bike off the stand and completely leaning it over, as I actually find this helps release quite a lot of air from the coolant system. But ultimately, the best way to get this really moving around is to get that thermostat open, so we're going to need to get some heat in there. So I look forward to starting it up and seeing if we can bleed this thing nice and easily. With the coolant change complete, the final step is just to start the bike up. Before annoying all the neighbours, I thought, you know what, let's get in to servicing the front brakes. They weren't looking fantastic, and I certainly wanted to check all the pistons and everything were in good order and moving freely, even though the front wasn't seizing on the bench. And as you'll see here, it's far from ideal, and this is part of the nature, unfortunately, of tinkering with old bikes. Using a toothbrush and some brake and clutch cleaner, I give the caliper a good scrub all around the pistons, inside the actual housing, just to remove any grime that's built up over the years. And unfortunately, it's not great news. The pistons have got pitting, as you can see here, which means it seems a bit of a false economy putting new pads in when they really need a full strip down. At this stage, I'm struggling a little bit with the build. We've got a bike that is unfortunately deemed a salvage write-off. Even though the engine is good, this bike, even with the low mileage, is never going to be desirable unless it's something you just wanted to keep forever. I didn't want to fit the new pads because personally it needs a full brake reel kit. So what I make the decision to do is clean the old pads up, which have still got plenty of life in them, and clean up all the pins to go back in. I think realistically it'd be foolish to fit the new pads without a full brake kit, and I don't know with this series. Let me know in the comments, guys. The first video didn't do amazing, so it's not doing wonders for the channel. I'm not really 100% behind it personally because of that salvage title. I just think we're going to patch it up and get it on the road. But yeah, let me know. Should we go the whole hog? But given the views, it just feels unlikely at the moment. With the left hand side all back together and looking a million times better than before, I replicate the whole process on the right hand side, and then with that complete we then move on to the brake fluid reservoir. Those that saw in the earlier episode, unfortunately this had snapped off at the mounting point and certainly couldn't be left like that. So the powers of eBay, I picked up a Chinesian one and we got to work on fitting that. With the new reservoir fitted, it's simply a case then of filling it all up with new brake fluid, which I picked up from a local Halford store. Normally I prefer to use Type 200 ATE, but this wasn't a race bike. I certainly knew the brakes needed to all come apart again, and as they were the only place open throughout the Christmas break, it seemed like the perfect stuff just to get in there and make sure all the brakes were working perfectly. Thankfully, with the ease of my hydraulic bleeder run off the vacuum, it's epic in getting this absolutely sorted in no time, making one man bleeding really easy. With both front brake calipers bled through nicely and the lever feeling a million times better, it was time to move on to the rear brake. Now, when I was testing the brake lights out, when I pressed the rear brake, it was actually seizing on. So Again, from past experience, a bike that's been left abandoned or not been used very often or not looked after, the pins and everything seize up and they do end up biting on, which is what was happening. So I needed to fully strip the rear caliper and just find out what was causing this to keep binding on, because I certainly couldn't leave it like that on the road. As predicted, loads of rust and corrosion that was preventing the pads from moving freely on the slider pins. What was a problem is removing the slider pins. Because there wasn't a hole on the outside for your sender punch through, I needed to use penetrating oil and just keep working them, which took me probably a good part of 45 minutes. And it's one of those jobs you could easily lose your patience and damage something, but eventually after moving backwards and forwards with the pins and a pair of grips, I managed to get both of them out, and they were certainly really corroded, and explained why the pads weren't moving freely on them. With both pins removed from the caliper without having to resort to drilling anything out, I show a quick before and after here between the stock pin and the one that I've cleaned up using the wire wheel. Certainly a million times better, but again, these all need to be fully stripped down, really stripped apart, new seals, new pistons, but one, I just don't have the time for this, and two, I'm just not going to be at this level with the build as I mentioned earlier. So I put everything back together and it certainly looks a million times better than when it came apart. With the temporary fuel supply now set up, it was a good opportunity to prime the oil filter, and essentially I leave the fuel tap in the off position and I just keep cranking until the oil pressure light disappears, and this ultimately allows the new filter to prime with oil, so when we get that first crank, she'll be nice and protected. With the temporary fuel tank tap, switch to the on position, I do a quick once over just to make sure we've got no fuel leaking, and then it's the moment of truth. Will she fire and will she hold coolant? I leave the bike a couple of hours to completely cool down before opening the coolant filler cap, and as you can see the system has opened perfectly and allowed all that air to be removed. So we top it up using the same coolant, and then it's just a case of refitting the cap, and that is a wrap for this episode. I hope you guys and girls enjoyed it, and if you haven't done so already, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button because we've still got some more to go on this bike, even though I'm not completely in love with the project. Until next time, thanks for watching.